1,110 Russian soldiers were eliminated by Ukrainian defense forces over the past day. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Thus, the total enemy losses since the beginning of the full-scale war have already exceeded 1,302,000 soldiers. In addition, the day before, the defense forces destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 4 armored vehicles, 85 artillery systems, and 3 multiple launch rocket systems. They also burned 199 units of Russian automotive and special equipment.
The training of Russian soldiers participating in the war against Ukraine is currently at a low level. This is especially noticeable when the enemy is taken prisoner. This was reported by Oleg Apostol, the commander of the air assault forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
It is very noticeable, especially when we take them prisoner and ask about their training. Their task is to send people into the meat grinder, which works in some directions. Of course, we would never allow ourselves to do that. We act based on training while they rely on numbers. For example, when a group of our guys goes up against a group of the enemy, we completely wipe them out and move on with minimal losses. Oleg Apostol, commander of the air assault forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in an interview with Ukrinform.
Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, is joining our broadcast. Serhiy, we are glad to welcome you. Good morning, glory to Ukraine.
Hello.
Glory to the heroes, glory to the defense forces. Greetings, colleagues.
Serhiy, if we look at the overall data and sum up the results for the previous month, the territorial gains of the Russians in this war basically amount to 0, if not a negative value. And according to statistics, contract soldiers are clearly no longer compensating for the losses. Ukrainian drones are simply wiping out this so-called second army of the world. What do you think Putin is counting on with such statistics at the front?
Well, actually, I think nothing has changed here and nothing will change in the near future. The Russians will continue trying to fight on the battlefield with 2 main components, infantry and, accordingly, aviation. Because we can clearly see that wherever the Russians can't even advance by a kilometer or 2 into our territory, especially when it comes to large or small settlements, Russian aviation starts to operate. It operates according to the Syrian principle, that is, the one known since the days of Surovikin, everyone remembers him, who fought and led this Russian occupation army against Ukraine. That is, to bomb our settlements, to wipe them off the face of the earth, thus trying to influence the defense forces, which, according to the Russian command, in this case should retreat and leave behind these so-called, I'm quoting the Russians, dead zones. Accordingly, they are trying to use infantry first and foremost. We see that they are once again switching to the tactic of small infiltration groups. Although, for example, at the beginning of March, we all remember well that the Russians, or rather not even the beginning, but the middle of March, the first month of spring, was marked by these kinds of mechanized assaults by the Russian occupiers. Moreover, this was happening in different sectors of the front, primarily the Donetsk, Eastern, and Zaporizhzhia fronts. The outcome of this for the Russians is also obvious. That's why today, infiltration attempts, this tactic is continuing again, and it is once again becoming probably one of the main ones on the battlefield. We are clearly noting this in the area of Kostiantynivka. Today, we also see that in both the Lyman and Pokrovsk directions, the enemy is trying to act in exactly this way. And as for the small air you mentioned, this really is a drone war. Today, Ukraine's defense forces are doing their utmost across all sections of the front to seize the initiative in the small airspace, and they are succeeding. The goal is to turn these kill zones, these gray zones, into dead zones for the Russians so that they cannot pass through them. However, the concentration of Russian troops in such areas of the front is very high. In any case, forms and methods of covert mobilization in Russia are ongoing because things with volunteers are not going as well as they would like. At the very least, the situation now is different from what it was at the start of the full-scale invasion. And of course, I can't help but comment on the words of the commander of the airborne assault troops. Indeed, as we've noted in our broadcasts with you, the training of Russian military personnel now basically comes down to this. You arrive at your assigned location, receive your uniform and weapon, and are sent straight to the front. The length of time you spend there depends on which sector this contingent is sent to. Well, let's put it this way. The luckiest ones end up as prisoners of war in Ukraine.
Regarding the claim that the Russian army had allegedly fully captured the Luhansk region, this information was refuted by the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Earlier, the Russian Ministry of Defense had announced these new so-called achievements. Ukrainian soldiers released a video and clarified that units of the 3rd Assault Brigade are still present in the region. The brigade added that over the past 6 months, Russian forces have made 144 assault attempts in the area of the villages of Nadia and Novoye Horivka near the administrative border with Kharkiv region. To do this, the enemy in particular deployed 19 pieces of motorized equipment and approximately 360 soldiers. Such assaults resulted in heavy losses for the Russians. 260 soldiers were eliminated. How do you assess this? Do these statements, as their Zit bloggers have already described about capturing land on credit, still actually work? What does it really achieve?
Well, first of all, it's probably a kind of self-reassurance in the Kremlin, obviously either in Valdai or in the bunker. That's the first thing. And secondly, well, we perfectly understand that the information restrictions that are already in place today and will continue to develop in this direction in the Russian Federation are obviously aimed primarily at the domestic audience. It's quite likely that such stories about supposedly very successful advances by the Russian army on our fronts are also intended for, well, I don't know, probably not for our Western partners. It's quite possible they're aimed at certain officials across the ocean, quite likely. Although we understand perfectly well that, well, there aren't really any strong arguments, and apart from these so-called flag plantings, there's obviously nothing else to show. But nevertheless, Russian propaganda very often tries to operate according to old templates. And it's clear that you're mentioning here some of the so-called Z-war correspondents. This is already starting to irritate even those who blindly believed, and quite likely still continue to believe, in the Kremlin regime. So all of this is aimed at the domestic audience. And of course, Russians are creating a certain background on which they can claim supposed victories, on which they can try to speculate, something Russia continues to do and will keep doing. The main thing here is how we respond to this, and accordingly our communications with our defense forces and what information is coming directly to us. And most importantly, the battlefield itself shows, especially in March, first of all, the counterattacks by the defense forces, which are still ongoing today. For the Russians, this has become something of a revelation this year, specifically on the battlefield. But I think, once again, we can't say everything on air, obviously. The surprises for the Russian occupiers on the front lines don't end with Ukrainian counterattacks. As for what happens next, I think we'll be able to see that in the near future.
Sergei, despite the fact that the Russians are becoming more active in the Lyman direction and the Konstantinovka area, and there are intense battles in the Huliaipol and Pokrovsky directions, the Pokrovsky direction still leads in the number of combat clashes. The Russians have achieved certain successes in the area of Raishain. On the other hand, Ukrainian defense forces are counterattacking quite successfully at the so-called Dobropilia salient. Why is this happening? Why does the Pokrovsky direction, despite the fact that Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad are already controlled by the Russian army, still remain the leader in the number of battles?
Well, essentially, the three sections of the front, the three directions you mentioned, Kostiantynivka, Pokrovsky, and Lyman, are naturally interconnected because the Russians, by trying to reach these lines, are attempting, let's put it in Russian terms, to stabilize the front and gain the opportunity to establish a foothold for an offensive on the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, something they have not managed to do until now. And when we already mentioned, for example, the tactic of infiltration by Russian troops, it's clear that these assault actions on the Kostiantynivka flank have failed, and the enemy is now trying to infiltrate there. And in fact, the strikes on Rudinsky and Hrishin, these are those assault actions, this is already the Pokrovsky direction, are once again aimed at a kind of stabilization of the front in the Russian way. And essentially, these are attempts to cut off logistics for our key defensive strongholds in Kostiantynivka and Lyman. That is, this is an influence, including attempts to impact our logistics, because accordingly, everything is very simple, unfortunately. When logistics are cut off, the troops have no way to continue fighting further. Therefore, I think that in this regard, the Pokrovsky direction today also carries such a logistical burden, among other things. And of course, it's clear that they want to make a statement again. We're talking about propaganda aspects here. The Russians want to claim that they have already passed through the Pokrovsky-Mirnohrad agglomeration and will now move further towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. That's why the situation is developing in exactly this way today. However, both the Kostiantynivka flank and especially the Lyman flank, not to mention Kostiantynivka itself, as you can see, are not only refusing to surrender to the enemy, but are also carrying out counterattacks there, both in the Lyman direction and in the Kostiantynivka direction. And these counterattacking actions of ours allow us, or rather force the enemy, to at least adjust their plans.
and regarding successes on the one hand and losses on the other. The Ukrainian armed forces have almost completely liberated the Dnipropetrovsk region. This was reported by the commander of the 1st Separate Assault Regiment, Dmytro Filatov. According to him, Ukrainian defenders are currently conducting mostly small-scale tactical operations, and the armed forces of Ukraine were able to achieve success in the Oleksandrivka direction thanks to a decision by Commander-in-Chief Syrsky. He preserved the personnel in Huliapol. The freed-up forces were able to improve the tactical situation in the Dnipropetrovsk region. There were many questions regarding Huliapol. How do you assess the situation now? And will the enemy attempt to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region again? What resources do they currently have for this?
Well, in fact, the desire hasn't disappeared. Moreover, through some of their actions, the Russians are trying to continue demonstrating this. It is important to understand that on all sections of the front, the Russians are trying to demonstrate their offensive capabilities, sometimes more successfully, tactically, and sometimes much less successfully. In this regard, nothing has changed, and I don't think it will change. Moreover, in some directions, the number of engagements, for example, is increasing. Well, for example, in the Pridniprovsk direction, you can see this yourself in the reports from the General Staff. As for the Huliapol direction, it is true that while the situation may not have been fully stabilized there and heavy fighting continues, at the very least we have prevented the Russians from gaining a foothold, and moreover, we managed to push them back from their positions on the banks of the Haicha River. And accordingly, we have already managed to carry out counterattacks in the Oleksandrivka direction and have practically liberated the entire territory of Dnipropetrovsk region from the occupiers. Everything played out asymmetrically. The Russians wanted to create a buffer zone for themselves there. Today we are trying to do the same thing, and quite successfully on our side, so that the enemy cannot launch offensives toward Pavlohrad or accordingly toward the regional center, Dnipro. By the way, this also applies to the regional center of Zaporizhzhia. All these actions of ours are aimed at making the enemy, well, obviously they haven't given up yet, but at least for a while, focus on regrouping and adjusting their plans for further offensive actions. That's why they have had some tactical surprises for the enemy, but today they are not really talking about them much. I didn't mention for nothing that the enemy will face surprises. I really think that's true on all sections of the front, from the North Slobozhansky to the Pridniprovsky and to the Crimean front, because it's obvious that the objectives in different directions do differ from one another. However, the common goal to hold back the enemy remains truly a shared task, and today the defense forces, by demonstrating character and the ability to strike the enemy with quality, are confidently fulfilling this task. We are facing a very difficult spring ahead and an equally challenging summer. That is probably a forecast that is obvious today. Well, as for autumn, I'm not looking that far ahead yet. I think we will succeed.
Sergei, thank you. We'll be glad to see you again.
Thank you.
Sergei Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, was in touch with our studio.